Well, dear colleagues, welcome to our monthly dialogue. As you know, dialogues are Socratic conversations with leaders in cardiology. And I remind you that Socrates believed that dialogues are the best way to reach the truth. And indeed, I think that this is the case. And today is a very interesting dialogue. Please remember that you can ask questions via chat, or you can raise your hand and you can ask your question directly. You can raise your hand or your avatar, your electronic hand. We are really happy to receive your questions because this dialogue are always very interactive. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our guest. Is a famous guest, as usual, is Giuseppe Brugada. And I've just learned that the right pronunciation in Catalan is Giuseppe, which is something very similar to Italian, to the Italian pronunciation with the Giuseppe. So I feel even more comfortable with Giuseppe Brugada. And I'm hosting Giuseppe with Robert Atala, who is our deputy editor for arrhythmias. And the title is an exciting title, is the Brugada Syndrome, narrated by Giuseppe Brugada. Robert, please, can you introduce our famous guest and we can start officially our dialogue.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Brugada, dear Professor Crea, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's certainly a great honor and pleasure to co-moderate this edition of European Heart Journal Dialogues with Professor Giuseppe Brugada Terradellas. As I'm sure that Professor Brugada is a legend in cardiology, and I believe he doesn't need a special introduction. Nevertheless, let me just very briefly point out some of his most important, outstanding achievements in his career. In 1998, he was promoted to full professor of cardiology at the University of Barcelona. And he worked in Barcelona for many years as the director of cardiology in the Hospital Clinic of Barcelona, where he served also as director of the Thorax Institute and medical director. He continues to be with this institution in the position of senior consultant in cardiology. Besides that, he is also heading arrhythmia department in 2 other Spanish cities. And maybe I should mention also that the International Institute for Arrhythmia Research in Porto Alegre in Brazil bears his name. Professor Brugada also has a long record of outstanding collaboration with the European Society of Cardiology. He served as the president of the European Heart Rhythm Association, and importantly, not to forget here, he also worked for many years as a deputy editor for the European Heart Journal. He is honorary member of many scientific societies. He has many honorary doctorates. And of course, last but not least, his scientific achievements are impressive. He published more than 600 papers, original articles in the most prestigious journals. These had more than 25,000 citations, and this makes a remarkable age index approaching 100. At the beginning, let me just mention a very special activity of Professor Brugada. In the last 10 years, he personally realizes a series of charitable activities in African countries where he treats children with arrhythmias. These children would otherwise not have an access to these therapies. So let me finish this brief overview, and I hope we'll be able to come to some of these points more in detail during our conversation. So, dear Giuseppe, let me ask you maybe the first question. Your first published study was in fact on ventricular function in patients with LAD stenosis. So what was the trigger for you then to switch to an avalanche of scientific papers in arrhythmias?
Thank you very much, Robert, for your extremely kind introduction. Thank you, Filippo, for inviting me to these dialogues, which is it's an honor and a pleasure. I learned that I'm following our loved Jean Brownwell as one of the masters in this dialogue, and this is a real pleasure. So it's true that was my very first paper. I was in France at the time, and I was trying to understand. I was doing my cardiology training in Montpellier with Professor Paul Puech and Professor Grolot. Grolot was the hemodynamist. So when I was working in the part of hemodynamics, I had some conversations with him, and I explained to him that I was very much interested in research. And then one of the things that he thought it might be interesting was to understand whether the patient with an LAD stenosis might have some impairment in the ejection fraction. Remember that this was early 80s, so we still had a lot to learn at that moment. But because I was working with Professor Paul Puech, my interest immediately turned towards electrophysiology. He was a master, a real gentleman in electrophysiology and in life, and he taught me so much about how to approach the patient and how to understand arrhythmias, and he was really a big privileged-minded person, and it was a pleasure for me to have him as my first teacher and master in arrhythmias and cardiology.
Great. So, of course, our audience, our guests know you especially as the author of the who discovered the Brugada syndrome, and the Brugada syndrome was not only a scientific or clinical scientific discovery, but this was also a moment which started a new era, basically the new era that we now name as primary electrical diseases of the heart, or more simply, channelopathies. So what is and we know also that there are three important Brugadas behind this syndrome. There is Giuseppe, but there is also Pedro, and there is also Ramon. So could you tell us a little bit more about this family history?
Yeah, well, the family history, and later we can talk about the Brugada syndrome history, but the family history is that we were born in a small village north of Catalonia, very close to the French border. This is called Banyoles. This is a city that now has around 20,000 inhabitants. When I was born, it was something like 10,000. This is a small village, a rich part of the country, very labor people that work very hard. And our family was a very hard worker family. It has never been a single doctor in the family before Pedro, which is the oldest of the three brothers. And Pedro, he had a strong vocational interest in medicine, and he started medicine. It was very difficult because our family was not a rich family, was a working family, so they had to pay everything that represents going to Barcelona, which is 120 kilometers away from our village. And Pedro did a very good job. He studied tremendous effort, and immediately 6 years later, because me and Pedro, we have 6-year difference, when he was finishing medicine, I started medicine. And then it was Ramon. Ramon is 8 years younger than me. So when I was already a doctor, he was thinking what to do. And of course, Pedro and myself said, you don't have any choice. You have to be a doctor. And so we had 3 doctors. We had a sister, and unfortunately she died at age 50. She was not a doctor. But the daughter of our sister, so our niece, she's a pediatric cardiologist, and she takes care and good care of every single patient with Brugada syndrome in the pediatric age. So in fact, we are 4 now, because Georgia, which is the name of our niece, she's an extremely strong woman, extremely hard worker, and doing a tremendous job with pediatric cardiology and sudden death. And she is a very well renowned and known cardiologist in the pediatric field. So this is a little bit the history of, I would say, a simple family, very hard worker family with a very strong mother that was pushing us towards doing university studies, because in our family it has not been the case in the past. My father, our father, he was having an abattoir of rabbits and chicken. So that was the job in our house. And so suddenly 3 doctors, and then Georgia, 4 doctors came to the scene.
Yes, thank you very much. So may I ask you, I will come back a little bit to the Brugada syndrome. Well, I was very happy to hear that your love for arrhythmias started in France, because this was also my case. I spent some time with Guy Fontaine. So, but the Brugada syndrome has also a link to Central Europe, and I think to Poland. So,
right.
Could you tell us something a little bit about this story?
Yeah, I can explain how everything started. In fact, it started in 1986. When Pedro, that he was in Maastricht, I was in France at that time, he was in Maastricht, and Pedro saw a Polish guy, 2 years old, that has been recovered from sudden cardiac death. And he had this very funny ECG, and then Pedro learned that his sister died at age 2, also after several cardiac arrests, but finally died. But there were some ECGs available also for the sister, and she had exactly the same aspect as his brother. So this ST segment elevation that we did not know what it was, the meaning of that. So this was put in a drawer, and these 2 ECGs were there. We discussed that with Pedro several times, but nothing special. And then we had the chance that 2 adults in the early 89, 90, 2 adults were recovered from sudden cardiac death in Maastricht, and they had exactly the same ECG aspect. And then Pedro, remember, we have these 2 ECGs of these 2 this boy and his sister, and then we put together these 4 cases, and we published that, or we present that as an abstract in the World Congress of Arrhythmias that was held in Washington in 1991. And then 4 other patients during this time came to our attention. And finally, we put together the 8 patients that were published in JACC. In fact, 3 months ago was the 30th anniversary of the publication. That was in November 1992 that the paper was published in JACC, after being rejected in many journals, because in fact the editors were saying that in fact we were not recognizing vasospastic angina in these patients. And of course this was the case, and we were not able to do the diagnosis of a vasospastic angina. So finally this was published in JACC in 1992, and as you know, immediately the impact was incredible. As you say, this was perceived as a change in the way we were looking at sudden death, especially in normal heart patients or non-structural heart disease patients. And this was a kind of madness around the world, publishing about Brugada syndrome everywhere. People was having patients that were not previously recognized, and the publications start to climb, and there are thousands of publications on Brugada syndrome since then.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is basically, I would say, the phenotype side of the story. And what about the genotype side?
Well, we are, of course, because of the two young brothers, siblings that were the initial patients, we suspected that this had something to do with the family history. It was not until 1995 that, because of the discovery of a family in Italy, in fact, in San Giovanni Rotondo, where a cardiologist working there, he found a family, in fact, a patient that died suddenly at age 24. He had a sibling that had the same ECG characteristics. And then he started to visit the family, and so that other patients, other family members had the same ECG. So we put together all these. I was in San Giovanni Rotondo with him, and then we were looking at the whole family. And finally, we identified 9 patients in this family. And this was the beginning of the genetic story, because of course we draw blood samples in all the family, and we send the blood samples to United States. And at that time in United States, in Houston, it was another Brugada working. That's Ramon, that had already finished his medical student. He was working in cardiology and genetics in Houston. So he did the analysis of this family, and we identified for the first time a mutation in the sodium channel in this family responsible for the phenotype. And this was published in Nature in 1998, where the first mutation was. As you know, since then, more than 300 mutations have been identified in the sodium channel, all of them having the same physiopathological effect, which is a premature closing of the channel, leading to an imbalance of currents between different parts of the heart, basically endo and epicardium of the right ventricle, and responsible for the phenotype and for the occurrence of what is called the phase 2 reentrant arrhythmias and ventricular fibrillation. So that's when Ramon, that was at that time working in the States, he worked in the States for 17 years, entered the story by doing the genetics of the disease and identifying the first mutation in the sodium channel.
Well, it looks like an unbeatable research team. 2 professors and the youngest brother, a PhD postgraduate. Yes, now more, I would say, more clinical question. How would you define nowadays, with all your knowledge, the Brugada syndrome? What would be for you the most appropriate definition?
Well, I think it remains rather the same that we defined at the very beginning. This is a clinical and electrocardiographic syndrome. I mean, basically, the diagnosis is because of an ECG. We should not forget that. And that means that the ECG still had a lot to teach us 30 years ago, and probably still has a lot to teach us. And it's just a matter of being curious. No, you have to be curious and trying to understand things. And if you are curious and you put questions yourself, probably then you start thinking that maybe there are things already non-described. And that was the case. I mean, remember, you have to go 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we started with the implantable defibrillator. We started with the invasive electrophysiology, but we're having people dying suddenly, the majority of them with the structural heart disease, myocardial infarction, ischemic heart disease, dilated, hypertrophic. But still, we had this 20-25% of patients dying suddenly where we could not find any structural heart disease. And this was worrying us a lot. So why normally young people 30, 25, 30, 35 years of age were dying suddenly. How was that possible without having any way to prevent that or to recognize those patients at risk? And so we were very much interested in that. And we were also very much interested because we were, of course, from Heinwell School, we're working in Maastricht, and we're very much looking at the ECG all the time, and it was the recognition of this abnormal ECG that led us to start thinking that maybe this had something to do with the sudden death episode, and this was the case, and later. We know that, of course, we have the long QT, but then we have the short QT, and then they have the early repolarization. And then, so there are many things that have been identified since then, because we were looking at the ECG with another eye, thinking that maybe there is still something to learn from the ECG, even more than 120 years after its initial description. And this should be a message for every single young cardiologist. Don't miss the ECG. In the ECG, there is almost everything written down, and if you look at it very carefully, you might identify things that are still there and have not been yet identified.
Thank you very much. Great message to our young colleagues, and I think it's now Professor Crea who would like to ask some questions.
Yes, Giuseppe, it's a fantastic story. And what you're saying, as you say, is very important for our younger colleagues. They must learn that careful clinical observation is fundamental, not only for good medicine, but also for seminal discovery, as we have shown today. Each patient can hide in himself or herself a secret, and it's up to the doctor to identify the secret. And this can really lead, as we have shown, to seminal discoveries. But now let's enter the clinical arena. When we have in front of us a patient with Brugada syndrome, the question is, well, does this patient need ICD or not? This is one of the most critical questions. Can you tell us what you think, for instance, about risk scores in Brugada syndrome? Are they useful? What is the best way to use them?
Let me first make a little bit of history. Remember that at the very beginning, like always in any new discovery, the 100% of the patients that were published by us at the very first patient were survivors of cardiac arrest. Okay, so we're 8 patients. So of course we learned immediately that fortunately not all patients with this abnormal ECG were having sudden death, and that sudden death was an accident in the history of this population. And we learned that, of course, we had to do some risk stratification process, and our main objective was how to identify the patients at risk, because of course, fortunately, as I say, the majority would never, with this abnormal ECG, would never have a cardiac arrest, and only a minority of them will do it, will have it, but how to identify it? So we learned that the gender is important, because males have more events than females, and probably the females are protected, not against the disease, because they have the same number of patients affected, males and females, but they have less events during follow-up and less abnormal phenotype during follow-up, probably because of hormones or whatever things that we still do not understand. Also, we know that the patient that has some syncopes, cardiogenic syncopes, during the history, his personal history, is a patient at risk, because one of these syncopes might finally produce sudden death. Also, of course, the patient that has been recovered from sudden cardiac death is a patient at very, very high risk, and the probability of having a second event is extremely high. Now, we understood that the asymptomatics is our major challenge when we are finding a patient with an abnormal ECG, either family member or not, but he has a type 1 ECG, the classical type 1 ECG. We know that this is a patient that might have a risk of sudden death, some authors have quantified it 1% per year cumulative over 10 years. So that's quite a lot for a young population. And how do we identify? And this is how the scores are working, trying to define the worst phenotype scenario possible. And in this case, giving points to each one of the possibilities. How is the ECG? How is the genetics? How is the family? How is the clinical history? Try to use all this information to give some score and to classify the patient in different risk scores. In this score, we always use the program electrical stimulation that I'm sure we'll talk later. Because for us, program electrical stimulation is a basic fact in the history of Brugada syndrome. And I will explain very easily why. In cardiac arrhythmias in general, when you have an abnormal whatever, and you want to induce arrhythmias, you use isoproterenol. In Brugada, you use isoproterenol to prevent arrhythmias. In other situations, you use antiarrhythmics to prevent arrhythmias. In Brugada, you use antiarrhythmics to produce arrhythmias. So it's completely the contrary of the normal classical electrophysiological situation. This should mean something. We cannot avoid this observation that the behavior of a patient with a Brugada ECG is exactly the contrary of any other situation in cardiology. And of course, this has to mean something. How is it possible that we are using isoproterenol to prevent arrhythmias instead of producing arrhythmias? So the fact that by manipulating the ECG with antiarrhythmic drugs and isoproterenol, we are also manipulating the ability to induce arrhythmias, because if you give us isoproterenol, you will never induce a ventricular fibrillation in a patient with Brugada. So this should mean something for the knowledge of the patient with Brugada syndrome. And of course, we are using this as a risk stratificating factor. I have to say that even those groups that were strongly against program electrical stimulation some years ago published in Circulation a paper that they were claiming that while finally inducing ventricular arrhythmias in patients with Brugada with 1 or 2 premature beats had a real risk stratification effect in these patients. So I think that the stratification, risk stratification, which is, as you say, the most important challenge we have in asymptomatic patients, should include also the program electrical stimulation and the risk scores. And all together, this information should allow us to try to identify a subset of patients, probably no more than 20% of the total patients with an abnormal ECG, asymptomatic patients that are at high risk. And probably in this 20%, we have to do more aggressive therapy, but also we are identifying 80% of them, which probably extremely low risk, where clinical follow-up might be sufficient.
Perhaps putting together scores and ventricular stimulation, one approach might be to use the score to start with, because it happens with all scores, also in cardiovascular prevention. The scores work well at the extremes. If the risk is very high or very low, they do well. If the score is intermediate, then you're in the gray area where you need more information. So perhaps start with the score. If you end up in the gray area, then programmed ventricular stimulation can be the way to go to further distinguish between white and black in this gray area. Do you agree?
I cannot be more in agreement with you. You know, the advantage of program electrical stimulation is that in asymptomatic patients, you would induce probably no more than 18 to 20% of the patients. So that means that you have 80% of the patients that will be non-inducible, and probably that they can be classified as extremely low risk. And this allows you already to exclude 80% of the patients from aggressive therapy, you know. And I think that this is very important. Of course, of these 20% are still inducible, fortunately, not all of them will have arrhythmias, but already you have reduced to 20% the amount of patients that might be at some risk of sudden death.
Giuseppe, can we bring to the scene also genetic testing? Do you think we are ready to use genetic testing for Brugada syndrome in our clinical arena?
We are ready to use genetic testing, not to treat the patients, not to make the diagnosis, because the diagnosis is not a genetic diagnosis, it's a clinical diagnosis, an electrocardiographic diagnosis, but it's very important for family members. So we use the genetic testing in every single patient with a type 1 ECG with Brugada syndrome to identify a mutation, because if we identify the mutation, then we can translate these results to the rest of the family and trying to see whether other members in the family have inherited the same mutation. If they do not have the mutation, then we are quite comfortable saying that you don't have the Brugada syndrome. And if they have the mutation, of course, then you have to follow them, probably do some provocative tests like an Ashmelin test and see whether they are at risk or not. But I think that genetic testing should not replace the clinical judgment, should not replace the clinical diagnosis.
Very important message again, not only for our younger colleagues, but for all colleagues listening to us. Well, then I have another family question. When you have in front of you a patient with Brugada syndrome, you have to decide whether to go or not for ICD. These three brothers usually agree on the decision or not?
That's a very good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. No, we don't agree completely. No, I agree. We don't agree completely. There are some parts of the family which are more aggressive than others, okay? I would say that I am in the non-aggressive part. I try to be extremely prudent, you know, because I know even in the diagnosis, I think that one of the big mistakes that we are facing, and in that we agree, the three brothers, is that there are an over-diagnosis of Brugada syndrome. There are many patients that do not have a Brugada syndrome, but are classified as Brugada syndrome. We are also guilty for that, okay? Why? Because we publish this famous paper in Circulation where we talk about the type 1, type 2, and type 3 ECG. And now, retrospectively speaking, probably this was a mistake, because the people are understanding, despite the fact that we'll repeat that in every single time that we have the opportunity, but the people is making the diagnosis, this is a Brugada syndrome type 3. And this does not exist. There is no Brugada syndrome type 3. There is an ECG that we classify as type 3 as suspicious, or type 2, and that you have to have a type 1 to make the diagnosis, but you cannot make the diagnosis of Brugada syndrome type 2. This does not exist. There is Brugada syndrome or there is no Brugada syndrome, and to have the diagnosis of Brugada syndrome, you need a type 1 ECG. All the rest are just suspicious ECG. And we are seeing, and I'm sure you too, a lot of consultations of second opinion consultations of patients that have been diagnosed with Brugada syndrome, and they do not have it. They do not have a type 1 ECG. And of course, the problem that creates in the family is enormous, because of course they go to internet, they put Brugada syndrome, and the feeling that they are going to die in the next 5 minutes is incredible. So I think that this is very important, again, for the young cardiologists. Please do not talk about Brugada syndrome in a patient if he does not have a type 1 ECG, because then you are creating a full big problem, social, family problem, whatever, you know, because they believe that they are going to die. And they are wrongly diagnosed with Brugada syndrome. The Brugada ECG type 1 is the only ECG that allows you to do the diagnosis of Brugada syndrome. This is very important.
well, this is a strong and simple message really to follow, because a lot of anxiety is created by type 2 and type 3. So thank you, Giuseppe, for this strong message. Well, I have a suggestion. If the three brothers do not agree on risk stratification, I trust very much women's wisdom. So now you have a niece. So if you don't,
Right.
please
Right.
ask her. I'm sure she will.
She will be the one balancing everything. I'm sure of that. I'm sure.
Now, I have some questions from the audience. In particular, very, very interesting. We have a message from Enrique Sanchez from Nicaragua, telling us that his team identified 2 Brugada syndrome in Nicaragua, and he thinks that one of the 2 has been treated by you. Do you confirm? Because
very well.
it shows how famous and global you are.
Well, with internet, it's easy to have information from everywhere in the world, and the patient contacts you, and then they send you the ECG. And of course, we are always open to help any colleague around the world that they are saying, oh, can you tell me I have this ECG, but I don't know whether this is a real one or not. Can you help me with what to do? And this is something that happens almost, I would say, every day.
Well, wonderful global community. And then we have a question from Theodore Serban. It doesn't say where it comes from. This colleague, Theodore Serban, the question is about fever and Brugada. Can you explain?
Very interesting. Extremely interesting. Because, first of all, because it's funny how retrospectively the situation of fever was already in our first paper. In our first paper, we were already explaining that 2 of the patients were having sudden death during the febrile episode. And we didn't know what was the meaning of that, but we write it down because that was the situation. Then we learned from the works done with genetics in the mutation that the mutation was temperature dependent. And the higher the temperature, the worse the working of the channel. So this immediately turns out in our head that we were seeing some patients having fever and a very abnormal ECG, and we start recognizing patients with sudden cardiac death during fever as the 2 initial ones, but many others occur in the literature. And now it has been a paper published with Sabrus. Sabrus is this consortium lead from Israel, and that has identified that the occurrence of sudden death during fever basically occurs in patients below 10 years of age. So it's extremely important in the family members, especially young kids of families with Brugada, to have an ECG obtained during fever, because if the ECG during fever is positive, these are at high risk population for having sudden death during the fever, and the fever should be treated very aggressively in this young population. So please remember, if you have family members, tell them. If they have sons or daughters, tell them. If the son or the daughter has fever, go to the hospital and have an ECG. And if the ECG is positive, then they have a Brugada syndrome and they are at risk. If the ECG is negative, it's almost the equivalent of a negative Ashmolean test. So you can be safe, and you know that probably he has not inherited the disease.
Thank you. Well, Professor Sanchez actually is ready to ask from Nicaragua. You remember?
Yes.
Before. He's ready to ask a question personally. Amelia, can we unmute Professor Sanchez? He's still there?
I think that was related to the previous comment, actually, but yes, Professor Sanchez.
Yeah, what's the previous comment? If he's with us, we can ask him to make comments directly. If not, we can, I've spoken too much. Robert, please, I'm sure you have further questions.
Yes, thank you very much. It was, in the light of the global warming, it's challenging to see probably that we will have more Brugada syndromes, which are falsely diagnosed. But right. This is what I try to say to my younger colleagues. But basically, the art of diagnosing Brugada is the fine art of interpretation of incomplete right bundle branch blocks.
Right.
This brings me back to the importance of ECG. I think what we experience now with the artificial intelligence is in fact a new opportunity for ECG. This is, as you mentioned, 120 years old, but there is a lot of information there that we were not able to see with our naked eye. But artificial intelligence could maybe probably help, and we will come back to that. But I will come back to our patients with Brugada syndrome. So in general now in treating cardiac arrhythmias, we are not very fond of drugs. Is this true also for Brugada syndrome, or do you see some chances for drugs here?
Well, we know from studies coming again from Israel that the use of quinidine could be useful in patients with Brugada syndrome. In fact, we are using quinidine in patients with electrical storms, and I have to say that there is a study coming from Spain with 27 patients with electrical storms, and that they were treated with quinidine, and 2/3 of the patients normalized the storm after quinidine. It's true that the storm is a storm, so the storm ends up also spontaneously. You have many episodes in 1 or 2 or 3 days, and then suddenly it stopped, and you never know whether this is the effect of quinidine or not. But the effect is that at least in 2/3 of the patients in this study normalized the arrhythmias using quinidine. So if you tell me, is there any chance for drugs? I would say yes, probably with quinidine. Probably, I would not use only quinidine as the sole treatment. I mean, for me, it's clear: is a patient has a risk or not has a risk? If he has no risk, he does not need any treatment. He does not need quinidine. He does not need an ICD. More and more, especially in young, we implant a loop recorder. Why? Because if a patient has a type 1 ECG and after risk stratification, the risk is not high, and we decide not to implant an ICD, the only thing that can change this decision is having a syncope. But of course, you know that you might have syncopes which are not cardiac syncopes. But if you don't have the proof for that, and the patient has a type 1 ECG and has a syncope, probably the immediate reaction will be to implant a defibrillator to protect him. However, if you have a loop recorder and the loop recorder demonstrates you that this was not ventricular arrhythmia, you are still safe. So you are not to be in a hurry to implant him, because the syncope you have demonstrated that is not cardiac in origin. So this is what we do basically in our patients with a type 1 and low risk, especially young patients, is to implant a loop recorder, and this allows us to be in the safe part if something happens. So and for the drugs, as I tell you, we use it as coadjuvant in therapy if needed.
Okay, so once again, a renaissance of an old drug for a new syndrome.
Sure, absolutely.
Of course, I would say the enormous progress of cardiac electrophysiology in general is linked mainly to catheter ablation.
Yeah.
And we have in the recent years some encouraging results with catheter ablation for Brugada syndrome. So my question is, and which I was intrigued at the beginning, is the following: can we really believe that catheter ablation focused on a relatively small area of the epicardium can treat a genetically determined disease?
This is a fantastic situation, because we might be for the first time in a situation that we are treating a genetic disease using a mechanical treatment. Exactly. And of course, we are not curing the disease. We are modifying the consequences of a genetic disease. And I strongly believe, and of course there is again a discussion, you know, Brugada syndrome has been a matter of discussion and controversy in every single step we have done. And this is again a big controversy. You know that I'm a strong defender that the Brugada syndrome is not a depolarization defect, it is a repolarization defect. And when we did together with Dr. Carlo Papone, we did a series of 135 patients with Brugada syndrome and ablation, epicardial ablation. We learned that when the patient has no ST segment elevation, has no anomalies at all in the epicardium or in endocardium. You can do the mapping, and the mapping is perfect. When you give ashmalin or flecainide and you do the provocation of ST elevation, then you start having some abnormal signals, which are completely different of the signals you see in fractionation or a slow conduction. I have been doing thousands of mappings in animals and in patients of fractionation and slow conduction. And I can tell you that the signals in Brugada syndrome, when you have an ST elevation, these are not fractionated signals. They are very slow signals, very late signals, which occur more than 250 milliseconds after the beginning of the QRS complex, which is impossible that these are conduction signals. These are repolarization signals. And when you go to this area and you have these abnormal signals and you do the ablation, then you get more ST elevation. And then when you see that you are eliminating the epicardium in this area, you are normalizing again the signals and the ECG and the ashmalin test. So you are modifying the balance of currents between different parts of the heart. There is a word that was said by a Brazilian electrophysiologist, that say André Davila, that once told me, okay, now I understand what you are doing is an ionic scar, not an anatomic scar. So what you are doing is you are peeling out the very external layer of epicardium, and by doing that you are eliminating probably the ions or the channels, especially ITO, which is at the basis of the whole problem, not because ITO is affected, but because there is a premature closing of the sodium channel. The ITO has nobody that opposes him, and then has a relative increase in effect, and this is probably at the basis of the Brugada syndrome. And by reducing the amount of ITO, by doing this elimination of the epicardium of the right ventricle, you rebalance again the situation between ions. And so you finally get the result of normalizing the phenotype in the different layers of the heart, and this normalizes the ECG and prevents induction of arrhythmias. This is what I think, of course. This is an hypothesis, and others believe that the ablation works because this is like a myocardial infarction or whatever, that you are eliminating some channels there. But I can tell you, when you map the epicardium of a patient with a Brugada syndrome without ST segment elevation, the layer is completely normal.
Yes, very, very interesting. Thank you very much. This brought me to the idea that could we talk about homogenization of the repolarization? This is what we achieve. When we achieve VT of ischemic origin, we want to homogenize the scar. Do we maybe homogenize the repolarization by eliminating the differences between epicardium and endocardium? This might be a possible explanation.
It's different from homogenizing the scar, because when you homogenize the scar, you are eliminating conduction channels.
Yeah, of course.
Which is different, okay? And here you are not eliminating conduction, you are eliminating this relative excess of ITO in the epicardium of the right ventricle. It's very funny that it's there. It's not in other parts of the heart, and it's there. And that's why Brugada syndrome is basically a disease manifested in right precordial leads. There is one thing that we forgot before when we're talking about the ECG. Do not forget to record right precordial leads in the upper spaces, in 2nd and 3rd intercostal space, which is extremely useful in many patients that you might be doubtful if you go up and then you get a very typical type 1 ECG when you go higher in the precordium.
This is finally the area where the right ventricular outflow tract is projected on the surface. This is the background. Yeah. Maybe a question for a little bit for the future. Do you think that once we will be able to substitute ICD in high-risk patients with catheter ablation, do you think this would be possible?
Look, my experience with the ablation is extremely positive, I have to say. Extremely positive. In Barcelona, in Spain, we do the ablation in patients with documented ventricular arrhythmia. We do not do ablation in high-risk population without spontaneous arrhythmias, okay?
And syncopal patient, yes? Syncope you ablate?
Yeah. If we have not recorded the ventricular arrhythmia, we are not doing the ablation. So, and in these patients, I have to tell you that the results are extraordinary because the patients do not have arrhythmias anymore, the ECG normalized, the Ashmelin test normalized, inducibility becomes negative. In Milano with Carlo, we did some patients with, let's say, not all of the patients had ventricular arrhythmias, about half of the patients had some documented arrhythmias, that half of the patients did not have documented spontaneous arrhythmias. Of course, all of them had an ICD, all of them have been implanted because of inducible ventricular fibrillation, etc., and a type 1 ECG. And in these patients, again, when you repeat the Ashmelin test 6 months, 1 year after the ablation, it's completely negative. So you normalize completely the response. So my question is, if this patient that has an ICD has a normal ECG, has a normal Ashmelin test, is not inducible, has not had any arrhythmia, is there still a patient there? Because these are all the characteristics that define the patient, and all of them are gone after the ablation. So, of course, we need sufficient long-term follow-up, especially if they are at very high risk or if they have had spontaneous arrhythmias, but probably this is something that in the future, if the results remain in the same positive way that they are going now, I think that it might be wise to think that maybe those intermediate risk patients with no spontaneous ventricular arrhythmias documented probably will benefit from ablation and not from the ICD.
Well, that would be a beautiful parallel in the future with WPW syndrome. We cure WPW, so maybe we will be able to cure another syndrome.
We hope so.
That would be a great thing. My last question before I again pass the word to Filippo is, in general, do you see a landmark new braking technology for catheter ablation? We are talking quite a lot about pulse field. What is your vision in this question?
I don't think this should be useful in Brugada syndrome. Why? Because our aim is not to create transmural lesions or create to break down the muscular cells in the whole in the whole heart, myocardium, but only to eliminate this excess ITO in the epicardium. So I'm not sure that the pulse field could be useful for that, but of course, everything is right.
Sure. My question was maybe a little bit more general.
General, yeah, sure. No, I'm sure that the new technology, I mean, that's the same. You remember, I was there with Dr. Paul Puech in the second fulguration that was done in the wall, that was done in Montpellier. I was a student there, so I was fascinated by that. It was a Mexican guy that had the right ventricular dysplasia, and a fulguration cured the tachycardia. Was like a miracle, And so, of course, the fulguration was the beginning of the whole invasive story. of course, immediately we understood that this was too aggressive and that some very important complications might occur. So then the radiofrequency ablation arrived and the cryoablation, and now we have the pulse field ablation, and others like laser, etc., are not working so good. So we'll see what's going to happen. But of course, the idea of modifying the myocytes without burning, without freezing, is something that is very attractive and might be very helpful in some situations, difficult situations, like for instance, the persistent or permanent atrial fibrillation situation, for instance. I think that this is something that probably in the very near future will be using broadly.
So after 40 years, back to the high voltage.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, I read the question from Dr. Omodara. Dr. Omodara, I see you on the screen. You tell us where you come from and what is your question.
So, so the question is,
Where do you come from? Where are you sitting?
I'm actually in Manchester at the moment. I work at the Christie's Hospital in Manchester. That's United Kingdom. That's where I'm calling from. So I'm attending the webinar from. Hi. Yeah. So my question basically is, if we find patients that that have got the type 1 Brugada pattern of syndrome, and they've not got any symptom per se of syncope or syncopal episodes, or they came into hospital with something totally different, nothing to do with symptoms of Brugada. What then do we do to their family members? Do we carry on investigating, or do we just lay down and wait till there's any sort of like syncopal episode or any sort of thing? So that's my question really.
We do the same for any patient with a type 1 ECG, whether he has been recovered for sudden cardiac death, whether he has an ICD or not, or whether he's completely asymptomatic and very low risk. We want to understand. We want to understand whether this is a family form or not. So we perform an ECG in Brugada position, so high precordial leads in every single first degree relative. Of course, if we have some doubts in some of the relatives, then we recommend to do a national neuroplecanite. If the ECG is completely normal, we just follow the family and follow the patient. As I was explaining before, very important in the child, we recommend to take an ECG during the fever, because if during fever the ECG is normal, you can practically exclude Brugada syndrome in this patient.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So you are from Manchester?
Yeah, Manchester.
Today we have a big match.
Today
exactly. We have Manchester United against Barca. So I hope we will beat you. Hope so, but
how we win. Yeah.
This brings me to my next question. They said more important than Brugada syndrome is Barcelona.
Oh yeah.
We all know that. So can you tell us more about Barcelona, your involvement, and which team is going to win the Liga this year? What is your?
The Liga is Barcelona. There is no doubt.
The score for that.
We are 8 points ahead, and we are going to win the league in Spain for sure. We have been in a dramatic situation economically, even in the last 2 years, and we have been very tough for us. But now we have very young people, extremely good players, very, very young. We have a very young team. The mean age is 19, 20 years of age, so it's incredible. And they are bright. And I'm sure Barcelona will come back and will win the Champions League, not this year because we are not there, but next year I'm sure that we will be there fighting for the Champions League. And of course, our big rival, which is Real Madrid. And I'm sure we will beat them. We have a Real Madrid-Barca next week in the Spanish Cup. I'm sure that we will beat.
Do you have a direct involvement with Barcelona?
Yes. Now we have been for probably 8 or 9 or even 10 years that our hospital, the team or the Barça came to me and asked me whether we could manage the cardiology assistance in Barça. And since then we are doing that, and we go to Barça every week because we are taking care of all players of Barcelona, not the professional ones. Every single player is about 3,500 players in the different sports, different categories, and we test them every year, every single one of them. We have a good record, is that so far we never had a sudden cardiac death in players of Barcelona in any category. And we try to convince ourselves that this is because we are doing this preventive studies in all the players, and I'm sure, and we fight that every sportist should have a preventive cardiological visit to avoid and to identify those patients that at risk of sudden death. And I think that this is something we should promote all over Europe.
Well, we are learning that, Giuseppe, you have really many talents. You are a top scientist, a very gifted clinician. Now we are learning about your experience in sport cardiology with this important team who will win Liga, which will win the Liga next year. But we have another talent, which I think is extremely important. I'd like you to share this fourth talent with us, which is philanthropy. Your philanthropic activities outstanding in Africa in particular. Can you tell more about?
Yeah, I always thought that we are very fortunate people because we are born in a part of the world where economically the situation is good, where we could study, we could do what we love more, which is being a doctor. We could go to university, we could work and have our life solved using the talent of treating people. And because we have been so fortunate, I always had the feeling that we have to give back part of this fortune to the others, especially to these others that are not having the opportunities that we have. And so that's why some 10 years ago, I decided that I would use all my capacities to bring the high technology to places where they would never have the opportunity to have high technology. So I have my portable EP lab, and I take my portable EP lab and I go to Africa, to Mozambique, to Egypt, to different parts of the world. And I decided that I would concentrate, also because of my experience with pediatric electrophysiology, which is very, very large. So I would concentrate basically on pediatrics. And I go to Africa, and I've been looking at our last data, and probably we have been treating with radiofrequency ablation around 1,200 children in Africa so far. And of course, this is only a minor part of those needing these treatments, but still, there are 1,200 children that are cured now that otherwise will still have tachycardias. And I always think that what is good for a child in Barcelona, in Manchester, in Brussels, or in New York is also good for a child in Maputo or in Asuan. And that the technology that we are using here and helps them should also be available for them. Although this would never happen, or the very near future would not happen there if someone does not go there with the equipment. So I take my equipment, I go there, and I enjoy it tremendously. And this is something that makes me especially happy.
Well, thank you, Giuseppe. This closes our dialogue with you. I wish to thank you for this brilliant participation. I thank Robert for hosting you with me. And I think that there are really several messages which can be identified during our dialogue. But I think that at the end, after this very intense and brilliant hour, the most important message is that Joseph Brugada is much more than the Brugada syndrome. Thank you, Joseph, for sharing
very much.
your life. And I'm sure it's a strong stimulus, in particular for our younger colleagues. So this brings our dialogue to the end. Next dialogue will be at the end of March, last Thursday as usual, March 30th at 17 Central European Time. And I forgot to tell you that this time, for the first time, our dialogue is live streamed not only in YouTube, but also in our Twitter account. So go to our Twitter account to know much more about the European Art Journal and about our dialogues. Thank you again, Robert and Giuseppe, for this brilliant conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. A pleasure.